Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters, and did you all miss me last week? Normally I go live every week for a live chat about quilting stuff, but last week I actually got to go to QuiltCon in Phoenix and I had a blast. So while yes, I did miss doing my weekly live chat, it was great to be around other quilters and look at quilts and eat all the things. So hopefully if you got to make it, you had just as much fun as I did. But I'm back here in cold, snowy, freezing Kansas City, and it's perfect quilting weather. What can I say? But this week, in this week's live chat, we're going to talk about how to tackle large areas of negative space, kind of within the whole idea like, how do I quilt this thing? So I'm going to give you some 3 basic tips, help break it down and kind of give you some inspiration so that when you're facing those quilts that you just don't know how to quilt, you can have some tools to help you get through it. But before I get to that, I want to tell you about some little deals that we have. We did a little bit of early spring cleaning here at Quilting is My Therapy, and we have several Build-A-Quilt blocks from last year. So these are our Block of the Month program, and each little package has a pattern and the fabric to make a block, and we have 3 different color options, and we have clearance these off for $3.99. So if you need a great little project for a retreat, all in its own little bag, if you want to make just a little 1-block mini quilt, definitely check those out. There's a link in the description box. They're only $3.99 per block, and we have several different options. So no rain checks while it lasts, so if you're not catching this live, so sorry if you can't get any, but definitely check those out because it's fun to have little projects to start with. If you were on YouTube at all today, you saw that I released a new episode of the Midnight Quilter. It's kind of like a February miracle, right? So they don't come out as often as they used to, but it's exciting because this one I was getting outside of my comfort zone. And I know if you're a quilter or a creative of any kind, sometimes it's really easy to stay snug with things that feel comfortable, but sometimes we need to stretch ourselves, get a little bit outside that comfort zone. And this time I made a quilt called the Westward Quilt in a color palette I wouldn't normally use. I mean, if you knew me, if you could see my head, I would love blue, gray, and a pop of another color, but I decided, you know what, let's go a little bit different with this. So I'm going to show you the quilt and go into a little bit more detail about the quilting. Definitely check out the tutorial if you kind of want to see how it comes together, but I'm going to just talk specifically about the quilting here because, like I said in the video, it's my fave. All right, so here's the color palette I went with. When you're stretching yourself outside of your comfort zone, don't make it like so crazy that you're hyperventilating the whole time. I felt comfortable with blue. We know I like blue, and a nice neutral with that bisque kind of solid, but then I threw in those other rich saturated colors just for fun. And if you watched the episode before the last one of Midnight Quilter, you know I have a lot of help picking out my fabrics, and Irene did help me pick out these fabrics. So I can't even take credit. I'll say I picked out the blue. I did that. But it's a fun way to just try something a little bit different. And so here is the second option I have. So I put together 2 different color options, one with solids and one with prints, because I know not everybody wants to quilt with solids. Maybe somebody doesn't want it quite so saturated and so, much like that. So this one is the print option. So you can find the links to both of those in the description box below if you want the kits or the thread or the pattern or anything like that. All right, real quick, I jumped ahead. So this is the actual quilt, the finished quilt, Westward Quilt. And as you can tell, there is some big areas. The block in the center is about 12 inches, and then everything else goes together very quickly using the stitch and flip technique. But I said in the video, and I say it all the time, sometimes it seems to be if the quilt is easy to piece, it can be harder to quilt, right? So nice and fast and easy to piece, that means I have big pieces, big areas to fill in, and that can be a little overwhelming. Like, how do I get started with that? What do I do with all this area? And so we're going to kind of break it down with some different options. But I did get a quick picture. Oh, sorry, my pictures are out of order. This will show you the print option and the solid option. You can see them next to each other. Again, totally a little bit different look, not quite as bold, but if you want something a little bit less out of your comfort zone. And then there's the quilt right there. All right, so I do want to tell you for the pictures I'm showing you and some of the diagrams, I quickly today put together a downloadable PDF with this blank diagram so you can audition, a couple of diagrams, and then pictures of the quilt. So if you want to get that, check the link in the description box. It's totally free, and you can kind of plan out your ideas. But when you're planning out your quilting ideas, let me just reassure you that you might not actually quilt what you plan. Go ahead and plan it if you want, but don't feel like you have to stay stuck to the ideas that you've drawn, because more inspiration might come. It might not work the way you want it to, but it's good to have a place to start. So I did snap a quick picture kind of before it was quilted, and you can see there's a lot of negative space. So how are we going to handle that? How are we going to get started with this thing? Because there's so much stuff, so much area to fill in. And so in the video, I broke it down to 3 quick, simple tips. And so the first one is going to be extending the piecing into the background area. So using the quilt pattern or the blocks as inspiration and quilting them in the background area to either build up blocks or just take up some of that large area that we're filling in. So let's see what that looks like applied to the center. Now I did this in a lot of different areas, but I specifically had fun with this in the center of the quilt, so I'm going to show you some step-by-step diagrams. And I'm going to pause real quick. If you're watching live, you have a question, be sure to type it out. Jessica's over here freezing along with me, writing down any questions you have, and I can answer them at the end. If you're not watching it live, no worries. Leave them in the comments below, and I get on there from time to time and answer them. All right, so let's talk about extending the piecing, replicating the piecing, or quilting ghost blocks, or taking that design, that pattern, and using it as inspiration for the designs. And so what I did is I decided my block in the center, I want that to kind of be the wow part because it's the center. Wanted to build that up because it's pretty small compared to the rest. So just extending that piecing. And what's so great about this is I can use the seams, I can use the blocks as a guide. I don't have to do any marking. Now in the video, I did kind of mark out some rough lines so you can see where I was going to go. And that's up to you. If you want a plan, a step-by-step guide, you can do that, or you can just go for it. So again, I'm just extending out the side and then adding some echo lines, creating my space, and then quilting it as though it were a block. This is also a great option if you didn't piece the block very well. Adding some more to it kind of gives you a do-over. Makes your points look perfect even if they're not. So after doing one side, I'm going to travel to the other, and using echoing, we'll see this here in a second, is a great way to shrink down blocks, but it also helps me separate the pieces. So I went ahead and echoed that center and moved to the other side and added on the other side. Now you're going to see the picture that's quilted here in a second. I got a little crazy with the thread color, but then going into the center and using those points kind of to connect and create this motif. Now, when I start quilting any quilt, even for the Midnight Quilter, I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to quilt it. Usually I kind of have a rough idea. For instance, I want to extend the piecing, but I didn't have everything planned out. And I think that's okay because you can kind of use the inspiration that comes as you're quilting. And it's kind of funny because Leah did ask this question on the type chat before we started. How much do the piecing or the blocks inspire the quilting designs? Is it mostly inspiration from the block or is it imagination? And I would say probably over 3/4 of it is inspired by the blocks themselves. I mean, this right here is inspired completely by the blocks. I'm extending that piecing and using the quilting to highlight the blocks. So, and then building out the other side. Now, what's kind of fun is this is just kind of real, like I said, real quick and rough. I put this together earlier, but you can make it as complex as you want. I didn't have to echo it if I didn't want to. I don't have to put this dense geometric filler on the inside, but I love quilting things to death. Quilt it till there's too much and add some more has always been my motto. So you can take this as far as you want. Please don't feel like you have to quilt it to death like I do. And here's kind of the last little bit with the background in there. So again, extending the piecing or quilting those fake blocks, it's going to really help build up that center. It's going to draw attention to it because it is what I think is the focal point of the block. And then recreating that. So I just thought it would be fun to add those little pieces in between the blue points. And I don't know, I just thought it'd be kind of cute to add a little more detail with the quilting with that little square. So really you can have a lot of fun. There's so many different ways you can go about doing this. And in the type chat before we started, I was chatting, I said, yeah, sometimes too many options can be harder to decide than not enough. So, but instead of looking at like, oh, I've got all this space to fill in, look at it like a playground of things you can fill in. And then I came back later, and we'll talk about echoing in a second, but I wanted to add just a little bit more detail to it. So I combined echoing and filler. And so what's really fun about the echoing is it kind of gives a little bit of contrast to the dense swirls that I did in the rest of it, and we'll see that here in a second. But again, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to quilt this center, but I really, really love how the center turned out. And here you can kind of see the finished product. What's kind of fun about this is sometimes, you get into a rut and you kind of stretch outside your comfort zone and then you realize, oh my gosh, this is so fun. I took a lot of pictures of the center part and I had to cut most of them out. I'm like, they don't want to see 50 pictures of the same thing. But what I want to point out is after I extended that piecing, added that quilting, I opted for a nice all over swirl, a little on the denser side because that's how I like it. And it just provides really nice contrast with the echoing. Again, not necessary, you don't have to do that, but it's just a little bit of detail, a little bit of fun. And a little bit closer. So what I want to point out, it's kind of hard to see, but in each row, I match the thread color to the block. So right around that orange block, those little fake piecing were quilted in orange thread, and then the green and the blue. Now this is a little risky because it does contrast with the background, and it is darker than the background. And I don't usually like darker thread on lighter fabric. But since the quilting is geometric, there's not a lot of backtracking, not a lot of thread buildup with that design. I knew it wouldn't overwhelm the piecing, although I think it would have enhanced it even if it did. So sometimes getting outside your comfort zone means trying thread colors that contrast just a bit. But again, you don't have to. I could have used that same light cream color to quilt that, extend those pieces out there. And a little bit closer look there. So yeah, a lot of changing threads here, but sometimes you just want to do that. You don't have to. You could just pick one to put all over the whole thing. But I had a lot of fun switching out the thread colors and playing around with it. And we'll see some more contrasting thread here in a second. Speaking of thread, so these are the colors I picked for the quilt. When you're dealing with a solid quilt, there's nothing to detract from, the quilting is just out there. And so I really want to make sure that the threads match the fabric that I'm putting it in, because that's going to keep the quilting from overwhelming the quilt top, especially if you think about the way I quilt, which is a lot. So I kind of pulled this out here so you can kind of see the colors. If you didn't want to do different colors, I would pick, a light, like this is a pearl, that's perfect for the background, and then maybe a neutral, like a medium gray for the rest of it. Just a good option there, and it's really fun because the quilting, the different thread colors really bring it out. And then another picture of the center where you can kind of see the different details in there. Now when we're recreating that quilt block in the center, I'm doing it outside the block. I'm building up the block, but you can also use it to take a big block and make it easier to manage. So in the big blue sections of this quilt, there's so much area, so much to do, and so I just kind of recreated the shapes to kind of quilt that same shape in the center and then added some echo lines. Again, if you think about it, it's going to take up some of that space, it's going to make it easier to manage, and then I can fill in the rest with a filler of my choice. So the reason this is so ideal is if you're quilting along on a sewing machine or a long arm with a smaller throat, you might not be able to fit the whole design in that area. Instead, quilting it smaller, breaking it up, and then moving on. I think you can quilt any quilt on any machine. You just might have to change the way you approach it, and this is exactly how I would approach it if I were quilting on a small machine. And then just a little bit closer up of the detail. Now I did, again, use the contrasting thread for two reasons. Having a little bit of the contrasting thread will allow you to see the pictures, or the quilting in the pictures. I want to make sure that, if I'm doing a tutorial on it, that you can see what I've done, but it does add just a little pop of color and fun to it. And even though I use the red in a little bit areas of the blue, and it contrasts, it's the same value, so it's not going to be blaring or overly glaring. It's just going to give you a nice subtle pop of color. All right, so first option, extending the piecing. It's going to be different for every quilt you work on, but just kind of look at the blocks that you like, see the pieces that you can recreate, and then go for it. But secondly, echoing. We all know that echoing is your best quilting friend. Echo, echo, echo. I even have a shirt that says it because it's so important. In this instance, we're using echoing to take these bigger areas and make them easier to manage. Sometimes I use echoing to highlight something, right? It's like a parentheses, like, ooh, look at this is really cool. But in this example, we're using echoing to take that bigger area and we're just shrinking it down. And what's really cool about echoing is you can add as many or as few echoes as you like, and you can choose the spacing that you want to do. So in the blue block with the points, just adding some echo lines, creating that same shape that's the edge of the block and just creating it over and over again is going to help emphasize the pattern. So do this in an area of the quilt that you like, and it's going to take that whole big area and just shrink it down a little bit. Again, if you are dealing with a bigger area or smaller machine, it's just going to make it more manageable. In the video, I quilted a yellow or an orange square, and it was just a little too big for my ruler. So adding some echo lines on one side of that triangle, sorry, I think I said square, makes it smaller and easier to manage. So even though you're echoing blocks with multiple sides, you don't have to echo every side. You can pick one side, pick a couple like I've done here. You can pick different arrangements and have fun with it. So echoing is definitely one of those tips that really come in handy. But when you're echoing outside of blocks, especially big blocks, they're going to get big really fast. And that's fine. But if you're working on a smaller machine, or let's say I'm on my long arm and I can't make it all the way down the side, well, there's nothing to say that your echo line has to go all the way. So here you can see in between the blue and the green, I have echo lines of different lengths. Now, this is not going to necessarily look great on every quilt, but on this quilt that's kind of deconstructed and modern looking, I think it's perfect. So echoing around the block a few times and then just adding some echo lines of different lengths just to kind of give it that more modern look. But here's the deal. If I do it right there in that particular area, because it's easier for me to do on my machine, I need to make sure that I do it a couple more times. I don't want to just put it in one area. I want it to look intentional, like it's an artistic statement, not just a cop-out or an easier way to quilt the area. So when you're echoing, echo inside the block, echo outside the block if you want, add as many or as few as you'd like. And I will say, in general, if I'm not sure what I'm going to do in an area, I start echoing until something comes to me. And sometimes nothing comes to me and the whole thing is echoed. But it's just a good way to get started. And here's just some more examples of the echoing not connecting to each other, the echoing kind of being a little bit more broken up. It's a really fun and easy way. So when you're looking at your quilts or you're working on them, ask yourself, how can I make this easier? And then take that idea and think, how can I make it look intentional? So how can I make it look like this is part of the design choice? But when we talked about earlier extending the piecing or quilting those fake blocks, I threw in a couple more echo lines. You can see it in the center of this picture. Again, just for fun. I say just for S's and G's, just to break up the area, just because I'm easily amused. There's no really any other reason besides that. So, but again, kind of throwing in those pieces, finding the amusement in things, it's just a lot of fun. And then again, there are those swirls filling it in. Now, if you look in the bottom left corner, there's some pebbles in that green area. And unfortunately, I had to cut this part out of the tutorial, but I was like, pebbles are definitely not in my comfort zone because I don't love them, but I do put them in little areas. I'm not going to put pebbles in the background, that light tan color of the quilt, because they take forever. So use a design in the bigger areas that you like, you're comfortable with, and then just say the stuff you don't like for the smaller areas. And again, more echoes. So again, inside, outside, different arrangements. It's amazing how a straight line can add some really different effects. And if you look at the blue point of the block, one side has 4 echo lines and then one other side has 2. I overlapped them so it could just give a little bit of a different texture. But really what that allowed me to do is quilt one set and then another set. I didn't have to come and continue them or connect them. Again, a little bit easier for that situation, and making it look intentional, I just made sure I did it in other places as well. It kind of goes along with that whole once is a choice, once is a mistake, twice is a design choice. Now this is kind of hard to see, so hopefully you can tell. In the orange block, if you look at the echoing to the right, you'll see that some of the echo lines, the very last one, comes close, but they don't touch. This is a great way to quilt those echo lines in sections without making it look deconstructed or having the broken bits of it. So again, I hope that makes sense. I quilted it up, traveled over and came back, and then made the next one come pretty close to it. If I do that several times, it's going to look intentional. It's going to give me that same effect of echoing without having to quilt that whole long line in one long motion. Because I know sometimes it's hard to reposition the quilt and move on. And again, more echoing. I love the echoing. I love the look of the curvy next to the echo lines. When you're picking out a filler to put around your designs, think texture, something's all over and similar. But I also like a little bit of contrast, so kind of creating something slightly different. And then you can see more dot-to-dot quilting. I didn't really show this in the tutorial, but again, using the echoing to make the block smaller, quilting the block or that design in a smaller area, and then using filler in the rest of it. So use that kind of as a jumping off point to come up with all sorts of ideas. All right, the last tip that I showed was connecting the dots. And this is probably the most abstract of the 3 because it really depends on the quilt that you're working with. But it can be an easy and fun way to make it look really intricate. So in the tutorial, I talked about what would happen if these points connected? What happens if I connect them all the way around? Does it make this secondary kind of medallion look? And so that's what I end up doing. If you look at the orange triangle, the points extend to the block, the blue block below. And I did quilt the outers outer lines in orange and then used the pearl color in the rest. Again, I liked a little pop of color in that area, but you don't have to do it. Then once I used my quilting to connect those, I have now different areas to fill in. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking that quilt, I'm using the quilting to break it up into chunks and then managing each of them as I work my way through it. So in between those lines where I'm connecting the dots, I just added some more straight lines, added some serpentine lines just to give it a different look. But again, making it easy, and I don't have to do any marking because I'm using the reference points on the quilt. I'm using what the quilt has there for me to use. And again, it's also helping to highlight the piecing and the overall pattern. There's a little bit closer look of the ferny kind of serpentine lines in that space. Once you do a design or an element like echoing or adding more piecing or whatever, echoing those lines helps build it up and kind of show it off a little bit more. So in this example, after I quilted those lines, adding a little bit more echo lines just helps separate it from the other swirls and just kind of make it more of a standalone element. If I didn't want it to show up very much, then I wouldn't echo it as many times. So you'll kind of know as you start working with your quilt, the more you echo it, the more you're showing it off. And again, another picture of it. So if you're not sure what points to connect or what designs you can come up with, just a rough sketch is pretty much all you need. If you have an ability to take a picture of the quilt and kind of sketch out some rough ideas, just imagine if this seam kept going, where would it go? If it ran into another one, what would they do? And it's a lot of fun to make that area a little bit more manageable. And then one last up-close picture of those serpentine lines, echoing, again, just having a good time with it and really enjoying it. Then, once you're like, okay, I can do all that, you can start combining them, right? So you can extend the piecing and add some echoing and then connecting the dots to create even more intricate designs like I did in the center. Adding those echo lines like I showed you already, changing thread for part of it, just loved it. So now I'm going to show you just a few more pictures kind of the overall quilt just so you can kind of see where everything is. But don't forget there is that downloadable PDF, so click the link in the description box and you can just download it. It has some photos in it so you can see it a little bit clearer. That way you don't have to pause it and look at my face making a weird face while you're trying to look at the picture. So again, pebbles, that's about as many pebbles as I like to quilt in one area. They just get very tedious after a while. Combining dot-to-dot designs to kind of highlight the more graphic look of it. Again, there's some more of those echo lines just kind of popped in that area just to break it up and have fun. And again, just having a lot of fun with it. I don't ever really know what a quilt's going to look like when I get started. I mean, I have a rough idea how I'm going to get going, but sometimes you get done and you're like, okay, I know what not to do next time. But sometimes you get done and you're like, oh, that turned out really cool. So I'm super happy with how it turned out, especially since, these aren't normally my colors, but I super, super love it. And I wonder how many times I can say super before it gets annoying. So when you're looking at your big areas of negative space, when you're kind of overwhelmed and you're like, man, I don't know where to go, I don't know how to get started, even just picking one of the tips and just getting going in a direction or getting going in an area will really help kind of get those ideas flowing. And it's just such an easy and fun way to emphasize the pattern or the fabric or even your great quilting designs. Now in the tutorial, I do say, if you don't love quilting as much as I do, that's okay. We can still be friends. You can just throw out the echoing, throw out the dense fillers, and pick a different design to put in each color and fill it in. You're still going to have this really cool, modern, solid quilt or print, depending on which one you pick. It's still going to look really striking. So don't feel like, oh, I can't do it like that, so I shouldn't try. That's not the case at all. So hopefully that's given you a couple of tips and ideas. I see Jessica's written down a couple questions for me, so I'll answer those. I will tell you I'll be back next week with another live chat, and I've decided, for those of you that are religious watchers of the live chat, a couple of weeks ago, probably more like a month ago, I did a live chat on swirling feathers, and then we lost power right towards the end. So I'm just going to redo the whole thing. We're just going to start it over. So next week's live chat will be about that. All right, great questions. What pins do I use? So you probably noticed on the quilt you can see some pins helping to stabilize it and hold it together. Those are not the best pins for stabilizing your quilt. Those are corsage pins from my long arm, but truthfully I couldn't find my other pins and I thought, well, these will work. All right, what are my thoughts on invisible thread? So invisible thread or monopoly, it's a monofilament thread. It looks like fishing line, it's clear, and that's great because it will go into all different colors. So I love invisible thread if I need to quickly quilt a quilt with a lot of different colors. So like this quilt, if you wanted to just do an all over the whole quilt, you don't want to change threads, using that on top is going to be a great way to go because it's just going to blend into the quilting. It can be a little more finicky to use though. You're going to want to quilt a little bit slower. You're going to have to adjust your tension and just take your time. But the result is going to be where the quilting doesn't show up as much. I also love invisible thread if I'm working on an applique quilt. Like I'm talking needle turn applique with tons of colors, where I know if one little bit of my quilting goes over in a contrasting area, it's going to take away from that workmanship that went into it. So those are some examples. There's a place for it for sure. In general though, I like to use thread colors because I like to play with all the threads. So it just depends on yours, your sword. Am I quilting westward on a long arm? I'm quilting it on a sewing machine with a little help from my long arm. So I kind of get the bigger areas done and then I'll pop it, put it on my long arm and take care of the rest of it. So it's kind of like a two-fold. It's mostly just quicker for filming. So a little bit of both. Did I frame out all the areas before I quilted it? So that is totally up to you. If you want to, take your time, put all your lines, go ahead and get it where you need to go. Absolutely, and that also is great because it helps stabilize the quilt when you start quilting. That way I can take my pins out and get to going. I would do that, but when I'm filming, I kind of like to handle that area while I'm there so you can see it, so that I don't have to like jump around. So how I quilt when I'm filming is not totally different, but there's a few differences than when I'm actually just quilting for myself. So it's up to you. Did I use the same color thread on top and bobbin? You can definitely do that, especially in solid fabrics. You don't want to see that bobbin thread pull up and kind of show and give you a pokey, as what it's called. But I just used my pre-wound bobbins, so I used light gray in all of it. The older I get, the lazier I get with my bobbins. I'm like, light gray is fine. Let's just use that. So it's totally up to you. Are the ruler feet interchangeable on different machines? Is there a generic ruler foot? So there is a generic ruler foot. I don't know which machines it works for, so you'll have to contact your machine manufacturer and see what they suggest. Most of the big manufacturers, though, make their own ruler foot. And so that's just that higher raised foot so that I don't have to worry about my ruler slipping over that and, breaking my needle, breaking my thread, and making me pee my pants. With the tiny swirls, am I using a micro quilting foot? So on some of the long arms, and I'm not sure about the sewing machines, but normally the foot on my long arm has like a round, it's like an echo foot kind of, but they make micro quilter feet where that circle is kind of gone so you can get right at it. I don't use that foot very much, especially not for swirls, because I'm looking ahead of where I'm going. So it might be helpful to those that really want to see where they're at and they want to do super, super tiny, but since I'm using a thread color that blends in, and since I'm quilting a design I'm really comfortable with, I'm just going for it. So again, it's totally up to you. I'm having problems with my circles. Any suggestions? Drink more. No, I'm just kidding. When it comes to circles, swirls, pebbles, all that kind of stuff, momentum is your friend. We are focusing on smooth and not perfect. So I don't care if your circle is perfectly round, I'd rather it be perfectly smooth, right? So sometimes it seems counterintuitive, quilting a little faster will be a little bit easier, because if you're quilting slower, you're overthinking it, you're making corrections as you're going, and it's not gonna be smooth. So try quilting a little faster, maybe. I mean, this is a really generic question, so I'm trying to throw some stuff out there. And if you're on a long arm, I find, for me, I get smoother circles when I have the stitch regulator turned off. So those are a couple options. Maybe that'll have to be a whole live chat topic. And did I use a ruler for the straight lines? Yes. So for almost all the straight lines on there, I did use my slim ruler, which you see in the video. The only time I don't necessarily use it is if I'm traveling along the edge of the block about 1/4 of an inch or so. At that point, I figure close enough is good enough. It doesn't have to be quite perfect. So yes, any of the longer lines I'm using my ruler, but shorter ones I might just leave it off to the side. Again, it just depends. Anyway, I really hope that you found these helpful. If you did, or you have any questions, leave a comment. I like to hear, what you thought about it, if you've applied any of these, if you've listened to any of the tips. I have teenagers that don't listen to me, so when I have anybody that listens to me, it's kind of a bonus. And like I said, I'll be back next week with the Swirling Feathers live chat. And don't forget, if you want to get the quilting diagrams, if you want to get the pattern, either one of the kits, thread collection, any of that, just click the link in the description box below. And if you want to get your cute little Build-A-Quilt blocks for your mini projects, be sure to check those out before they run out. All right, everybody, stay safe, stay warm, and I will see you next week. All right, until then, happy quilting.